If you think this story begins in the Strait of Hormuz, you are already one step behind the danger. The strait is only the stage. The ships are only the props. The blockade is only the visible gesture. The real event is something far more serious and far more expensive. It is the collapse of disciplined decision, making inside the most powerful state in the world. When I study risk, I do not begin with slogans. I begin with structure. I begin with incentives. I begin with whether the people making the decision understand the cost of being wrong. And when I look at this crisis, what troubles me is not only the military move, or the failed negotiations, or the public threats. What troubles me is that the whole sequence carries the smell of improvisation. That smell is expensive. A few days before, we were hearing about negotiations, then a ceasefire appeared, then the ceasefire blurred, then Israel escalated in Lebanon, then the terms became unclear, then the basis of negotiation seemed to disappear. Then the negotiations failed. Then the United States moved toward a naval blockade in Hormuz, as if the answer to a blockade is another blockade, as if confusion can be stabilized by escalation. That is not the rhythm of a disciplined process. That is the rhythm of a system lurching from one emotional impulse to the next, trying to force order onto reality after it has already lost control of the sequence. When I was younger, I learned that the most dangerous thing in markets is not fear. Fear is visible. The most dangerous thing is people mistaking noise for control. They believe because they are speaking loudly. They are acting effectively. They believe because they issued the threat. They therefore own the outcome. They believe because they have power. They automatically have clarity. That is delusion in a necktie. And when you scale that delusion up from an overconfident investor to an overconfident state, you no longer get a bad quarter. You get war, sanctions, blockades, counter moves, dead civilians, broken supply lines, energy shocks, and a public left trying to figure out whether any adult is actually driving the machine. What strikes me first in this whole affair is how incoherent the visible chain of events has been. One moment the message is annihilation. The next moment the message is ceasefire. Then, almost immediately, the surrounding battlefield begins moving in the opposite direction. Israel behaves as if it does not want a ceasefire at all. Lebanon becomes the subject of argument. Intermediaries say one thing, regional actors say another. Washington appears to hesitate even on what was supposedly already agreed. This is not subtle diplomacy. This is what it looks like when two partners are supposedly on the same side, but one of them wants negotiation only as theater, while the other seems to think pressure itself is a strategy. I have seen versions of this in business. A company says it wants a merger, but really wants leverage. A buyer says he wants a long-term partnership, but really wants surrender. An executive says he is negotiating, but what he really means is that he intends to intimidate until the other side breaks. If the other side does not break, the executive has no second act, because intimidation was the only tool he brought into the room. That is what this feels like. The public story keeps changing because the internal method appears not to be method at all, but impulse. The negotiations were reportedly built on one set of conditions. Then those conditions seemed to evaporate. Iran had its list. The United States had its demands. At one point, the public was told that a basis existed for talks. Then the visible framework seemed to disappear. If you are trying to understand that sequence through the lens of coherent statecraft, it will look irrational because it is irrational. You are trying to read a spreadsheet when what you are really looking at is a mood swing that matters because mood is not policy. Mood cannot carry a crisis. Mood cannot price retaliation. Mood cannot assess second-order consequences. Mood cannot tell you what happens when a regional adversary decides that absorbing pain is cheaper than submission. And this, to me, is where the deepest mistake sits. There seems to be a belief inside this process that America can still huff, puff, threaten, bomb, posture, and force an outcome, simply because it wants one. That if the United States sounds sufficiently certain, the other side will conclude resistance is hopeless and yield. I have no reason to believe that assumption matches the world we are actually living in. In fact, the last several years suggest the opposite. What has become clearer, not less clear. is that major rivals and regional powers do not automatically fold because Washington raises its voice. They absorb, they counter, they wait, they widen the theater, they drag the timeline, they raise the cost, they target the assumptions behind the threat, and then they force the United States to discover late and publicly. That coercion is not the same thing as control. That lesson has repeated so many times that if you still refuse to learn it, the problem is no longer lack of information. The problem is ego. And ego is a terrible way to run a superpower. I want to slow this down because most people will look at the surface drama and miss the machinery beneath it. The surface drama says the United States is confronting Iran. The negotiations failed, and Hormuz has become a pressure point. The deeper story says that one side appears to believe it can bully its way through reality, while the other side appears to believe it can survive the blows long enough to make that bullying fail. If that is the actual structure, then the war of narratives matters less than the war of endurance. And in wars of endurance, the side that mistakes volume for leverage is often the side that discovers its weakness too late. I do not say that lightly. Iran did not accept maximal demands before. It is not obvious why it would accept them now after military pressure. Public threats and visible efforts to force capitulation have failed to produce surrender. If anything, the evidence points the other way. When a state believes the threat is existential, it generally does not become more compliant under public humiliation. It becomes more committed to proving it can still impose cost. That is one of the oldest patterns in history. If you corner an actor whose survival is on the line, you had better be certain you can finish what you started. If you cannot, all you have done is harden the actor you hope to soften. And that brings me to another point that keeps bothering me. This does not look like the United States government functioning through a serious institutional process. It looks individualized. It looks personalized. It looks like decisions running through one man, a handful of loyalists, scattered fragments of influence, and a rolling storm of posts, calls, pressure, improvisation, and vanity. That is not how grave decisions are supposed to be made. A mature state, especially one considering escalation in a strategically central waterway, should be operating through layers of review. Intelligence should be tested. Military options should be stressed. Tested diplomatic consequences should be compared. Congress should be briefed. Departments should argue. Memos should circulate. Dissent should be formalized. Back channels should be active. Legal authorities should be examined. Allies should know the boundaries. Adversaries should hear consistent signals. That is what institutional competence looks like. What we seem to have instead is a public sequence so erratic that even observers who pay close attention are left reconstructing policy from fragments, leaks, contradictions, and the emotional cadence of one man's public behavior. That is not reassuring. That is terrifying. When President Kennedy faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States did not run that event through midnight improvisation and ego performance alone. There were arguments, tapes, departmental positions, military warnings, political concerns, diplomatic pathways, internal disputes. None of that guaranteed wisdom. But it provided structure. Structure does not make people smart. It prevents stupid people from doing maximum damage at maximum speed. When structure disappears, speed becomes the enemy. And modern crises move fast enough already. One detail that keeps surfacing in the reporting is especially revealing: the idea that calls, messages, and personal interventions from Trump were shaping negotiations in real time, repeatedly, impulsively, almost theatrically. I was not in the room, and neither were most of the people commenting on it. But even secondhand, the image is revealing. It suggests not a government executing strategy, but a leader trying to dominate the process moment by moment through force of personality. That method can work in television, it can work in branding, it can even work in some types of property negotiation, where bluff, pressure, and volatility can unsettle a weaker counterparty. It is a terrible method for handling a war crisis involving multiple states, multiple fronts, military risks, energy markets, and nuclear-era signaling. Why? Because a television-style approach is built on the assumption that the audience cannot hit back. Iran can hit back, regional actors can hit back, markets can hit back, oil can hit back, global logistics can hit back, political allies can drift, adversaries can stall, and when all of that starts happening at once, the one-man show becomes a one-man trap. Every extra threat raises the price of backing down. Every failed prediction exposes weakness. Every unfulfilled boast becomes an invitation for the other side to test you again. That is how empires bleed through overcommitment, and I think we need to say something even more uncomfortable. There are signs here not only of bad process, but of instability at the top of the process. I do not use that phrase casually. In markets, I learned a long time ago not to diagnose people from headlines. But I also learned not to ignore patterns that are screaming at me just because polite society finds them awkward. When public behavior becomes erratic, when statements become increasingly detached from discipline, when messaging veers from threat to self, glorification to religious imagery, to vulgar outbursts, to strategic contradiction, you are no longer looking only at ideology. You may be looking at impairment. That possibility has to be on the table, not because it is convenient for one party or another, not because political opponents enjoy saying it, but because the presidency of the United States is not a ceremonial office. It is a command position loaded with power. If the individual occupying that position is unstable, then instability becomes a national security variable. You do not get to ignore that variable because it is impolite. The United States just lived through a separate version of this problem. In the final stretch of Joe Biden's presidency, the country saw what it means when obvious decline is hidden, minimized, managed, and denied by the people closest to power. For months, the public was told not to believe what it could see. Then a debate happened, and denial collapsed in real time. That episode should have taught Washington humility. Instead, Washington appears to have learned nothing. What happens in a presidential system when the person at the center is impaired, erratic, detached, or psychologically unsound? The instinct of insiders is not transparency. The instinct is concealment. The instinct is preservation. The instinct is to protect the office, protect the circle around the office, protect the careers dependent on the office, and keep the machine running long enough that the public never gets a clean view into the actual condition of the decision maker. That is not a partisan point. That is a structural point. It happened before in American history. It can happen again. And the danger becomes greatest when the system around the president is too weak, too afraid, or too compromised to impose restraint. Which brings us to Congress. In a sane republic, members of Congress would be forcing themselves into this discussion. They would be demanding clarity on authorization, on war powers, on the legal basis for escalation, on the chain of command, on the diplomatic objectives, on the risk to regional stability, on the consequences for energy markets, on the role of Israel, on the role of intermediaries, on the red lines, on the exit strategy. That is what constitutional responsibility looks like. Instead, what we appear to have is paralysis. The party in power ducks, the opposing party fumes, everyone watches, nobody wants to bear the cost of direct confrontation with a president who can turn on his own allies more viciously than he turns on his opponents. The result is a political class that looks at danger and asks not, "What is my duty?" but "What happens to my seat if I say this out loud?" That is how institutions decay. They do not decay only because bad leaders arrive. They decay because the people who are supposed to restrain bad leaders decide that survival is more important than responsibility. I have seen this in business boards as well. Directors know something is wrong. They know management has become erratic. They know numbers are being stretched or rationalized. They know a risky acquisition is being pushed through by vanity. But each director waits for someone else to say it first. By the time someone finally speaks, the damage is already on the books. Government can do the same thing on a much larger scale. And I think there is a wider pattern here that we should not ignore. The same broad assumptions keep appearing in one arena after another. The assumption that China can simply be sanctioned, blocked, or technologically cornered into compliance. The assumption that Russia can be collapsed quickly through pressure and narrative. the assumption that Iran can be bombed, threatened, isolated, and then made to accept terms written in Washington. In each case, the underlying belief is the same. The United States remains so dominant that the rest of the world will eventually discover resistance is futile. That belief is outdated. It may be emotionally satisfying. It may be politically useful. It may still animate speeches and television panels, but it is not a serious reading of the world. The United States remains powerful. It remains militarily formidable. It remains financially central, but it is not omnipotent. And the refusal to adjust strategy to a more multipolar world is not strength. It is a form of denial. Denial is very costly when it operates inside a declining decision-making system, because then you get the worst combination possible: reduced relative power combined with an unchanged appetite for coercion. That is where incompetence becomes dangerous. Not ordinary incompetence, grand incompetence. Systemic incompetence, the kind that lives at the intersection of corruption, ego, amateurism, and institutional hollowing. A lot of people still imagine Washington as a machine full of serious experts at every important lever. That image is outdated too. The top layers of the system turn over politically. Influence is bought. Appointments are often rewards. Loyalists matter more than competence. Donors matter more than depth. Friends matter more than rigor. In good times, that may remain partly hidden because the machine has enough inertia to keep functioning. In crises, the emptiness at the top becomes visible all at once. Then you find out who is actually making the decisions. And that discovery can be humiliating. Think about trade. Think about the belief that tariffs, semiconductor restrictions, and coercive pressure would produce quick compliance from China. Think about how often confident predictions were made in Washington, with no serious understanding of the target's capacity to adapt, retaliate, or absorb the pressure. Think about how often public officials sounded genuinely surprised when the other side answered back. That is not expertise. That is amateur theater in a high-cost arena. The same habit now appears in this crisis. The same confident language. The same belief that power alone is a substitute for understanding. The same emotional satisfaction in the threat itself. The same neglect of what happens if the threat fails. I want to be very clear about something. The issue is not that the United States has interests. Of course it has interests. Every state has interests. The issue is not that coercion is never used. Of course coercion is used. The issue is whether coercion is being used by people who understand the structure they are entering, the adversary they are confronting, the allies they are relying on, and the limits they themselves possess. I do not see evidence of that understanding here. I see evidence of personalization. I see evidence of chaos. I see evidence of a state apparatus trying to turn impulse into doctrine after the fact. That is a fragile way to govern. And if you want to understand why the public feels confused, it is because confusion is rational when the process producing the policy is itself confused. People keep asking, what is the plan? That may be the wrong question. The better question may be, how much of what we are seeing is the product of no plan strong enough to survive contact with personality? Once you ask that question, a lot of the apparent contradictions stop being mysteries. They become symptoms. Why do negotiations seem to have a basis one day and lose it the next? Because the basis is unstable. Why does escalation continue even when a ceasefire is being discussed? Because one actor in the partnership may not want the ceasefire at all, and the other lacks the discipline or leverage to impose coherence. Why do public messages swing so violently? Because the center of gravity is not a stable process, but a volatile individual. Why does Congress remain strangely passive? Because the political cost of intervention feels higher to legislators than the constitutional cost of silence. Why does Washington keep looking surprised by reactions that outside observers considered predictable? Because the system has become insulated from reality by its own mythology. Once a great power begins believing its own mythology more than the world around it, strategic errors multiply very quickly. That is what history teaches. You can see it in empires that became too large for self-correction. Bureaucracies stiffen, patronage expands, elite competition intensifies. Institutions become more theatrical and less competent. The language of power remains grand, but the quality of decisions underneath that language deteriorates. Reform becomes harder because too many careers, too many myths, and too many interests depend on pretending that nothing fundamental is broken. Then, suddenly, small crises expose large weakness. I am not saying the United States is finished. Serious nations do not disappear because one administration behaves recklessly. But I am saying that the style on display here is the style of a country that has not yet accepted the difference between being strong and being able to get whatever it wants. Those are not the same thing. A mature power understands trade-offs. It understands bargaining limits. It understands that not every rival can be broken quickly. Not every theater can be dominated cheaply, and not every public boast can be turned into reality. An immature power, or an aging power led by unserious men, confuses command with capacity. That confusion is everywhere in this story. It is in the assumption that Iran would simply crumble. It is in the assumption that regional escalation could be managed through message discipline when there appears to be almost no message discipline. It is in the assumption that a blockade around a critical choke point can be treated as a press release rather than as a move loaded with second-order consequences. It is in the assumption that if Washington says the word negotiation loudly enough, coercion ceases to be coercion. It is in the assumption that public bravado can cover private strategic weakness. None of that is sound, and this is where I want to pull the lens back one more time. The Strait of Hormuz matters. Yes, it matters because it is a lifeline of energy transit. It matters because any military action there carries consequences well beyond the immediate region. It matters because it can become a trigger point for price shocks, logistical stress, broader regional confrontation, and hard-to-reverse escalation. But even that is not the deepest lesson. The deepest lesson is that when the people running the most powerful machinery in the world begin behaving like amateurs with gigantic tools, every choke point becomes more dangerous than it should be. The machine becomes unpredictable, not because geopolitics is inherently unknowable, but because incompetent operators make outcomes wider, wilder, and harder to price. That should frighten any serious person. I have spent my life trying to separate what is noisy from what is fundamental. In markets, the daily headlines are usually noise. The balance sheet is usually more important. In business, public messaging is usually noise. Incentives and governance are usually more important. In politics, speeches are often noise. The process underneath the speeches is often more important. So what is fundamental here? Not the latest boast, not the latest denial, not even the latest tactical move. The fundamental fact is that the visible American decision process in this crisis appears hollowed out, over-personalized, weakly institutionalized, politically unrestrained, and strategically unmoored from the realities of a multipolar world. That is the balance sheet. And it is not a strong one. If you want a clean phrase for it, here it is. America is not only facing rivals abroad, it is facing a competence crisis at the center of its own power. That crisis has been building for years. It did not begin with this week. It did not begin with this war. It did not begin with Trump alone, and it did not begin with Biden alone. But in moments like this, the accumulated rot becomes visible because the stakes are too high for performance to hide it. Then the country discovers whether it still has enough institutional depth to stop foolish men from dragging it into a larger disaster. I am not yet convinced that it does. And if you ask me what the final choice is here, it is not merely a choice about Iran or Israel or ceasefires or blockades. It is a choice about whether the United States is still capable of governing power through institutions rather than through impulse. That is the real threshold. Because a country can survive a bad leader. A country can survive a failed negotiation. A country can survive a humiliating week of foreign policy confusion. What becomes much harder to survive is a political culture that normalizes incoherence at the top, fear in the legislature, amateurism in the executive branch, and mythology in place of strategy. That combination compounds. And when it compounds long enough, the next crisis is always more expensive than the last one. So I would not look at this and ask only whether the blockade holds, whether the talks resume, whether the messaging improves, or whether the markets calm down for a few days. I would ask something harsher: who is actually making these decisions? What process, if any, is restraining them? What assumptions are guiding them? What evidence do we have that those assumptions are connected to reality? And if the answer to those questions remains vague, personalized, contradictory, and unstable, then the risk is larger than Hormuz. Then the risk is that the leading power in the world is being governed not by disciplined judgment, but by impulse wrapped in spectacle. That is how capital gets destroyed. That is how credibility gets destroyed. That is how deterrence gets destroyed. And eventually, that is how nations discover that the loudest man in the room was never the strongest man in the room at all. He was simply the least constrained. History is not kind to systems that put that kind of man at the center of decisions this large. And the market war and the world are not sentimental enough to forgive it forever.